Every cook who has ever stood at that range left something behind in the kitchen at Aldwick Hall. A recipe, a warning, something meant for whoever came next and no one else. Nell Marsh did not know that yet. She only knew that the position had opened without any real explanation, that nobody in the household much liked to say why, and that the moment she stepped through that servant's door, nothing about the work she thought she already knew would stay the same again. Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. She arrived on the last train of the evening, alone, later than she meant to be. No one met her at the station but a driver who said almost nothing at all. Just one word, when he took her trunk. Aldwick. Not quite a question. She said yes. And that was the whole of their conversation. All the way to the gate. The lane narrowed after that. The hedgerows closed in on both sides, black and close enough to touch, close enough that she could hear them rather than see them. Small, unseen things settling back into place as the trap rolled past. She had no way of knowing, yet, that somewhere ahead of her, in a kitchen she had never set foot in, a small green notebook was waiting in a drawer that was not like the other drawers, that it had been waiting, in fact, for quite some time. For her, though she did not know that either. Nell Marsh sat with her trunk at her feet and her work bag on her knees and watched the dark get darker. A different dark than London's, thicker, more complete, without the orange smear of gaslight she had stopped noticing years ago and only now, in its absence, noticed keenly. She was 36 years old. She had been cooking since she was 14. First as a kitchen maid in a house she barely remembered now, except for the particular ache of her feet by the end of each day. Then as undercook, learning the range and the timing and the thousand small disciplines that separated a kitchen that ran well from one that merely survived its own week. Then as cook in her own right, in 2 successive households, neither of them particularly large, neither of them particularly distinguished, but both of which had given her what she needed. The knowledge, the speed, the particular confidence of someone who had stood at a range in every condition a range could produce and had not yet been defeated by any of them. She had come to Aldwick Hall because it was not London. This was, if she was honest with herself, the whole of the reason. Not the position, which was good. Head cook, a full kitchen staff under her, a household that ran properly and expected to be fed properly. Not the wages, which were better than her last position, though not so much better that the difference alone would have moved her. Simply that it was not London, that it was Devon, that it was a lane in the dark, with hedgerows on both sides, and a horse that knew where it was going, and a silence that was the real kind. Not the silence between city sounds, the pause between omnibuses and costermongers, and the distant, permanent hum of a million other lives being lived close together, but the silence of a place that had always been quiet and saw no particular reason to change. The trap turned through a gate, iron and old, standing open as though it had not been closed in some years. And the house appeared. Aldwick Hall was large. She had known this already, from the correspondence, from the household accounts sent ahead of her for review, from the staff list, from the menus the previous cook had left behind as guidance for whoever came after. Large enough to require a kitchen maid, a scullery maid, a still-room maid, and occasional extra help brought in from the village when the family entertained. Large enough to have its own kitchen garden, its own dairy, its own gamekeeper, who supplied the house with whatever the season offered and whatever the woods and the river gave up. Large enough that the East Wing, she had been told in a single brief line in one of Mrs. Poole's letters, had been closed for some years now and was not expected to be opened again. But knowing a house was large, in the abstract, from figures on a page, and arriving at it in the dark on a November evening, were different things entirely. She looked at the facade as the trap came up the long drive, gravel giving way under the wheels with a sound she would come to know very well in the months ahead. Warm grey stone, the Devon kind, the kind that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, holding whatever brightness the day had given it until the light was gone entirely, and then simply becoming part of the dark itself, indistinguishable from the sky behind it, except where a window broke the surface. Many windows, most of them unlit at this hour. The upper floors dark, the family wing dark, the east wing, when she found it with her eye and understood which part of the house it must be, darker still, a darkness with a different quality to it, though she could not yet have said what that quality was, or why she noticed it at all on a night when she was tired and cold, and had been travelling since before dawn. But at the far left of the ground floor, low and long, the familiar amber glow of a kitchen that had been burning since morning and would burn, in one form or another, until morning came again. The kitchen that was now hers, though she had not yet stepped inside it, though she did not yet know its range or its particular temperament, or the way its fire drew on a windy night. She looked at that single lit window the way she would think later. A sailor might look at a lighthouse, not with sentiment exactly, simply with the recognition of a thing that told you where you belonged and that you were nearly there. The housekeeper met her at the servants' entrance, a low door at the side of the house that Nell would learn to use so habitually in the months ahead that the grand front of the house would come to feel like a face she saw only occasionally on a stranger. Mrs. Poole was a woman of perhaps 60, small and very upright, the posture of someone who had spent 40 years reminding herself and everyone around her to stand properly, and had long since stopped needing to think about it. Clear eyes, sharp without being unkind, an expression that was not unfriendly but was not yet warm either. The particular expression of someone withholding judgment with professional courtesy until judgment could be properly formed, on evidence. Over time, the way a good housekeeper withheld judgment about everyone new until the new person had shown, through their actual conduct, what sort of person they were. "You are later than expected," Mrs. Poole said, not unkindly, simply as a fact requiring acknowledgement. The main line was delayed, Nell said. "I am sorry for it." Mrs. Poole looked at her for a moment, a long enough moment that Nell understood something was being assessed, the set of her shoulders perhaps, or the way she held herself after a full day of travelling, or simply the tone of her voice, whether it carried apology without excess or excess without sincerity. Whatever was being weighed, It seemed to come out satisfactorily, or at least not unsatisfactorily, because Mrs. Poole's expression did not change, but her posture eased very slightly, a degree that another person might not have noticed, and that Nell, who had spent 20 years reading the small physical signals of people deciding what to think of her, noticed at once. "The kitchen staff have gone to bed," Mrs. Poole said. "I have left something for your supper. I will show you the kitchen tonight, and the rest of the house tomorrow, when there is light enough to see it properly and time enough to do it justice." She led Nell through a narrow servants' corridor, stone-floored, the walls close, lit by a single lamp carried ahead, and then through a door into the kitchen, and Nell stopped in the doorway the way she imagined she must have looked to Mrs. Poole. Entirely still, simply looking. The kitchen was the largest room she had ever worked in. The ceiling rose higher than any kitchen ceiling she had known, high enough that the light from the lamps did not fully reach the beams, which stood in a kind of gentle shadow above everything, hung with drying herbs, rosemary and thyme, and, curiously, a bundle of lavender that had no obvious culinary use but that someone had hung there anyway. She thought, for the smell alone, for the particular calm a kitchen took on when lavender was somewhere in the room, even if it never touched a single dish. The range ran along the far wall, enormous, more ovens and hot plates than she had ever commanded at once, and beside it, the true fireplace, older than the range by at least a century, its lintel black with 100 years of smoke, a fire burning in it now. Not a cooking fire, but a warming fire, the kind that was kept through the night in a large cold house, because the alternative was a kitchen that never fully recovered its heat before morning came and demanded it again. Copper pots hung along one wall, dozens of them. Every size and shape a kitchen could require, arranged with the deliberate order of someone who had placed each one exactly where it would be most useful and had expected, reasonably, that it would stay there. They caught the firelight and gave it back, the whole wall alive, with the particular amber warmth of well-kept copper in a room lit mostly by flame. A long wooden table ran down the center of the room, scrubbed pale by years of the same treatment, the grain of the wood raised very slightly under her fingers when she rested her hand on it, the way old scrubbed wood always was. A dresser stood against one wall holding the everyday crockery, and shelves beside it held the dry goods. A kitchen this size required in quantities she would need weeks to properly learn. Flour and sugar and salt, and the smaller jars of spices that told her, without anyone needing to say so, that whoever had run this kitchen before her had cared about more than merely feeding people. And on the hearthrug in front of the warming fire, a cat, grey and white, deeply asleep, arranged with the particular completeness of an animal that had found exactly the right spot and had no intention of ever reconsidering the matter. "That is Thomas," Mrs. Poole said. "He came with the house. He does not belong to anyone in particular, though he has opinions about who feeds him. And those opinions will very shortly include you. Your supper is on the table." She left. Nell stood in the kitchen, alone with Thomas, and the fire, and the wall of copper, and the smell of the room, old stone and wood smoke and the fading warmth of a day's cooking that had happened here before she had ever arrived. The particular smell of a kitchen that had been a kitchen, properly and continuously, for a very long time. She sat at the table and ate her supper, cold beef and bread and a wedge of hard cheese. and a cup of tea from a pot, still faintly warm on the back of the range. She ate without hurrying, looking around the kitchen as she ate, learning it the way she always learned a new kitchen, slowly, with full attention, beginning with the general shape of the room and moving gradually toward the particular being where the real knowledge of a kitchen actually lived. She was still in that slow process of learning when she noticed the drawer. It was set into the dresser, not among the drawers she had already opened without quite meaning to. The ones holding the expected contents of any working kitchen, string and spare candles, and the accumulated small tools a kitchen gathered over years. This was a smaller drawer, set slightly to one side, easy enough to miss unless you happened to be looking carefully, which she had been, out of the habit of a cook who always wanted to know where everything in a new kitchen lived before her first proper morning began. She pulled it open. Inside, a single object, a notebook, small, cloth-bound. The cloth a deep green that had faded over time towards something between green and grey, the spine slightly worn along its length, the edges of the pages softened with handling, the particular softness that came only from being opened and closed many, many times over many years. A notebook that had been consulted often and was now here, in this small drawer, set aside, left. She lifted it out. She turned it over in her hands. The cloth faintly warm from the kitchen air. No name on the cover, no label. Simply the notebook itself, unremarkable to look at. And she would come to understand before the night was finished. Not unremarkable at all. She opened it. The first page held no recipe, no list, a single line, written in a small, neat hand. The ink faded to a soft brown that spoke of years rather than months. For the kitchen, and whoever tends it, Nell read the line twice. She turned the page. The second page was a recipe. But not only a recipe. Above the ingredients and the method, a heading, written in the same small, careful hand, for Mrs. Poole, when the cold gets into her hands in January. Below it, a soup, simple, onion and barley, the stock of a roast chicken, a small amount of cream added at the very end, warming without being heavy, the kind of thing made for someone who needed warmth from the inside rather than merely the outside. Nell looked at the heading again. For Mrs. Poole, when the cold gets into her hands in January. She had met Mrs. Poole perhaps 40 minutes earlier. She had not yet seen her hands closely. She had certainly not yet seen January. She turned the page. The third, for James, when the horses are difficult, and he will not say why. A bread recipe, dark rye flour and treacle, dense, the kind that took real time to make properly and produced. At the end of that time, something that lasted, something substantial enough to be eaten with very little else, and be felt for hours afterward, in a good way, the way a well-made thing was felt. She did not yet know who James was. The coachman, perhaps, or the groom, or someone else entirely, whose position she had not yet been told. She turned the page again. The fourth, for the young footman, Thomas, not the cat, when he has had a letter from home and cannot eat at dinner. A custard, warm, very simple, the kind a child might recognize immediately and trust without needing to be told what it was. the kind that asked nothing of the person eating it, that required no decision at all, only that they be willing to sit and eat something warm, because it was there. Nell set the notebook down on the table beside her half-finished supper. She looked at it, at the faded green cloth, at the pages she had already turned, each one carrying a heading and a recipe, each one written for a specific person in a specific moment that the writer had somehow known would come, or would come again, or would keep coming, the way certain kinds of trouble kept coming to certain kinds of people in a large household. Predictable in their general shape, even when unpredictable in their particular arrival. She thought, who wrote this? She thought about the previous cook, the one whose menus she had been sent ahead of her arrival as guidance, whose kitchen this had been before it became hers. She realized she had never learned the woman's name. The correspondence had referred to her only as the former cook, which was the ordinary and slightly careless way these things were handled. People came and went from positions, and the positions themselves continued regardless, as though the work mattered more than whoever happened to be doing it at any given time. She thought, whoever wrote this, I would like to know her. Whoever had written it knew this household intimately, knew Mrs. Poole's hands in January, before January had even properly begun, knew James, whoever he turned out to be, and his particular trouble with horses that would not be discussed aloud, knew a young footman well enough to know exactly what a letter from home, or the absence of one, could do to a person's appetite. She picked the notebook back up. She turned to where she had stopped. She kept reading. She read while the fire settled and needed tending, and was tended and settled again. The pages turning slowly in the warm kitchen. Thomas still asleep on the hearthrug, entirely unbothered by her presence. The copper pot still giving back the low glow of the fire along the wall. The house very quiet above and around her. The particular quiet of a large building at rest, and beyond the small high window, the November night pressing close, and on the glass, just visible if she looked for it, the first faint suggestion of frost beginning to form, page after page, each one a person, each one a moment that had not yet happened to Nell but had, evidently, happened many times to whoever came before her. For Mr. Carew, the butler, when the family has been difficult and he has managed it without complaint, which he always does. A potted game, something that took real time to prepare and required good ingredients handled properly. The kind of dish that said, without needing to say it in words, that the effort behind it had been noticed even when no one upstairs had thought to notice it themselves. For Lily, when she has been crying in the scullery and will not say why. A small cake, lavender and honey, the kind that smelled of something calmer than whatever the present moment happened to be. For Godwin, the gamekeeper, when the winter has been long, and the woods have given up less than they should, a pie, made with whatever he had managed to bring in, treated with more care than the ingredients alone might have suggested they deserved. He will know. The note beneath it read, simply that, 2 words, as though the writer trusted that a man who spent his life reading the small signs of the woods would recognize, without needing further explanation, the meaning of a pie made specially and set aside for him. For Agnes, in the still room, when her mother has been unwell again, and the letters from the village say so before she has had the chance to say it herself. A plain seed cake, nothing elaborate, the kind that kept well and could be eaten a little at a time over several days. Because grief of the ongoing kind, the kind that did not resolve quickly, needed something that could be returned to, rather than something meant to be finished all at once. Nell paused at this last one longer than the others. She thought about a still-room maid whose mother was unwell, about a household large enough and old enough to have accumulated this many small, specific griefs and troubles, each one known, each one answered in advance by someone who had clearly spent years simply watching. Without appearing to watch, the way people in a kitchen were positioned to watch everyone else in a house without ever quite being seen watching in return. She turned the pages more slowly now, giving each one the attention it seemed to require. For the family's youngest daughter, who is 7 and afraid of thunderstorms, warm milk with honey and a pinch of nutmeg. Bring it to her room yourself. Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face. Nell read this and sat still for a moment. Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face. The recipe itself was almost beside the point. The instruction was the thing. The understanding, arrived at through what must have been years of quiet observation, that a frightened child did not need warm milk so much as she needed the warm milk to be a reason for the presence of another person in the room with her. However briefly, however wordlessly, she thought, whoever wrote this understood people. Not in the abstract way of someone who had read a great deal and thought carefully about human nature in general. In the much more specific way of someone who had watched particular people in this particular house for a very long time and had noticed, patiently, what each of them needed and had found that a kitchen, properly used, was exactly the place where those needs could be met quietly, consistently, without any ceremony at all. She looked at the clock on the mantel. Well past midnight now, later than she had meant to stay up on her first night in a new position, later than good sense recommended for a woman who would need to be at the range again in a few short hours. She closed the notebook. She held it for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, feeling the worn cloth under her fingers, and then she set it back in the small drawer, carefully, the way you returned something that clearly mattered a great deal to whoever had made it. She banked the fire for the night, the ordinary sequence her hands knew without needing instruction. She rinsed her cup. She did the small closing things a cook did at the end of a kitchen day. Not because anyone required it of her at this hour on her very first night, but because the kitchen deserved it. Because leaving a kitchen properly, whatever the hour, was a form of respect for what the room was and what it did. At the door she paused and looked back. The banked fire, low and steady. The copper pots holding their last warmth along the wall. Thomas, profoundly asleep, one paw drawn over his nose. The table where the notebook had sat, now empty. The drawer closed again around it. She thought, this is a good kitchen. She thought it simply, without qualification, the way a person thinks something that is simply, plainly true, and requires no further argument. She went upstairs to the small room that had been prepared for her and undressed in the cold, and got into a bed that was unfamiliar but properly made, with clean linen and enough blankets against the Devon night. She lay for a while listening to the house settle around her, its particular sounds, old stone and older timber, the wind moving through the elms somewhere beyond her window, the deep, thorough quiet of a part of England that had always been quiet and intended to remain so. She thought about the notebook, about each careful heading, about the person who had written for the kitchen, and whoever tends it without knowing who, that whoever would turn out to be. She thought, it was left for me, not for her specifically, not by name. She had not been hired when the words were written and might not even have been known to exist, but for whoever came next, for whoever opened that particular drawer and found that particular notebook and understood, as she was already beginning to understand, exactly what it was for. She closed her eyes. The house settled further around her. Somewhere below, the kitchen held its banked warmth through the night. Patient, waiting for morning, the way it had clearly waited many times before, for whoever would come down at first light and build the fire back up and begin again. She was in the kitchen well before 5, though no one had told her to be. She had woken in the dark, in the unfamiliar room, well before the hour she needed to, had lain there for a while, and found that lying in the dark in an unfamiliar room had never suited her, not in any position she had held. And so she had risen, dressed quickly against the cold, and gone downstairs, because the kitchen was where she needed to be, and there seemed little sense in delaying the fact. The kitchen was cold at that hour, not bitterly. The banked fire had held through the night, and the range was still warm to the touch, but cold in the way of a large stone room that had rested through the dark hours and was not yet fully itself again. She built the fire up methodically, laid the range, filled the kettle and set it on. The ordinary sequence of a cook beginning her day, a sequence she had performed so many times in so many kitchens that her hands carried it out without needing instruction from her mind, which was free, this morning, to be somewhere else entirely. Thomas appeared as the fire caught, materializing in the way cats always seemed to materialize, simply present where a moment before he had not been. He sat beside the range and regarded her with the frankly assessing expression of an animal deciding whether a person was, on balance, worth his attention. She did not immediately feed him. He appeared to find this an acceptable answer for the time being, and settled into a loaf shape beside the growing warmth. She made her tea and sat at the table with it, and took the notebook from the drawer, and found her place, and read on in the quiet of the early morning kitchen, the pages coming one after another. For the cook herself, she found some pages in, an entry addressed not to any member of the household, but directly to whoever happened to be standing at the range reading it. When you have been on your feet since 5, and it is well past 2 in the afternoon, and the dinner is still to be done, make this for yourself. Eat it standing, if you must, but eat it. Below the heading, a recipe for a simple egg dish. Quick, substantial, requiring nothing. A kitchen did not always already have to hand. And below the recipe, a single further line. You are allowed to sit down. The kitchen will wait. Nell read this twice. She thought, whoever wrote this knew that the person who feeds everyone else is very often the last person anyone thinks to feed properly, and that this was a kind of oversight that needed correcting deliberately in writing, because it would never correct itself. The kitchen maid arrived a little before 6, coming in through the scullery door with the faintly defensive manner of someone who expected, out of long habit, to be found at fault before she had done anything that could reasonably be called a fault. She stopped short when she saw Nell already at the table with the notebook open before her. "Good morning," Nell said. "You are?" "Lily, ma'am," the girl said. A girl of perhaps 16, thin, watchful, in the particular way of someone who had learned that watchfulness kept a person out of trouble more reliably than confidence did. Nell glanced at the notebook, at the page she had read the night before. For Lily, when she has been crying in the scullery and will not say why, she said only, "Good morning, Lily. The fire is up. I will need the bread started within the half-hour." Lily nodded and went to the bread table and began working in the careful silence of someone new to a situation and not yet certain of its rules. Nell watched her hands for a moment as she worked. Competent enough already. The rest would come with time, and then rose and went to the range and began the true work of the morning. By 7, the kitchen was fully itself. The scullery maid arrived and set to sink work. The kitchen maid steadily threw the bread, Nell moving between range and table and larder with the particular economy of someone who had been doing exactly this for 20 years and understood that the shape of the first hour set the tone for every hour that followed it. Mrs. Poole came at 7:30. As Nell would learn, she did every single morning without exception. Not as a demonstration of authority over the kitchen, but Nell came to understand, quite quickly, out of a genuine and long-practiced interest in how the day was beginning. The way a person who had run a large household for many years understood that the kitchen was the organ on which the whole body of the house depended, whatever the family upstairs might imagine to the contrary. "You were up early," Mrs. Poole observed, taking in the bread already on the table, the range fully going, the scullery maid already at her sink. "I always am," Nell said. "Mrs." Poole's expression shifted very slightly. Not yet warmth, but something moving toward the beginning of it. A degree of the same easing Nell had noticed the night before. "The family dines at 7, she said. "Mrs. Aldwick prefers plain food. Well made. She does not care for surprises at the table." "I understand," Nell said. Mrs. Poole nodded and left. And Nell watched her go. The upright figure, the careful, deliberate walk of someone managing some private discomfort without ever once allowing it to show in her bearing. Nell thought about the page in the notebook, about hands and January and cold, and looked, without quite meaning to, at Mrs. Poole's hands as she reached for the door handle. Too early in the year yet to see what January would eventually bring. But she found she was already watching for it. James came to the kitchen door at 10 for his mid-morning tea. A man of perhaps 45, weathered by outdoor work, carrying about him the particular economical quietness of someone who spent most of his hours with animals and had, over the years, adopted a good deal of their manner. "Good morning," he said, and took his cup and said, "Thank you," and left again. Nothing at all about horses, nothing about difficulty of any kind. But Nell had read his page the night before and watched him go with the attention of someone who now knew something she had not known 24 hours earlier. The young footman, also called Thomas, came through at noon, perhaps 19, careful in the particular over-formal way of a young man newly in his first proper position and anxious to be seen doing it correctly. He stopped to report that luncheon had been well received upstairs, said it with a slight excess of ceremony that suggested he had rehearsed the sentence on his way down and had decided it needed saying properly. Nell thanked him. She watched him go and thought about custard, about letters that did or did not arrive, about a young man far enough from home to feel it keenly on the days a letter failed to come. In the quiet after luncheon, she took the notebook out again and read while Lily washed up, and Thomas the cat slept on the hearthrug, and the fire did its steady, patient work and in the afternoon she walked out to the kitchen garden with the gardener. A man of perhaps 60, unhurried in his movements, the knowledge of the garden settled deep in him, in the way that only came from a great many years spent in the same soil, watching the same beds through the same cycle of seasons until the knowledge stopped being information and became simply part of how he saw the world. He showed her the winter beds, the herbs still holding on despite the cold, the root cellar with its stores laid in careful rows, told her what would come ready in December and what in January, and what she would need to send for from the village, and what the garden, patiently and reliably, would continue to provide on its own. She listened carefully. This was part of the work she had always loved best, the slow discovery of a new kitchen's true possibilities. Because every kitchen was different, every kitchen held its own particular relationship with what surrounded it, its own private economy of what could be had and what could not, and what a good cook could make of each. Walking back through the garden in the low afternoon light, she found the gamekeeper waiting near the scullery door with a brace of birds and a manner as unhurried as the gardener's, though quieter still. A man who spoke, she would learn, only when there was something specific that needed saying, and never simply to fill a silence. He set the birds down, touched his cap, said, "Cook," by way of both greeting and introduction, and Nell said, "Godwin, I think," and watched something shift very briefly behind his eyes, the small surprise of being known by name on a first meeting, before he nodded and said nothing further and went on his way. She thought of the pie, of the two words beneath it, "He will know," and understood a little better already what the notebook had meant. She learned Mrs. Poole's true story, or the first careful edges of it, that evening, after dinner had been served and cleared, and the family had withdrawn to the drawing room and the staff had scattered to their own quiet hours, when it was only the two of them left at the kitchen table with the last of the day between them. The previous cook, Nell said. How long was she here? 31 years, Mrs. Poole said. And her name? Martha. Mrs. Poole said. Martha Webb. She said the name, simply, the way a person said the name of someone they had worked alongside for 3 decades and who was now gone, and whose absence remained, somehow, a presence in nearly every room they had once occupied together. I found her notebook, Nell said, in the small drawer in the dresser. Mrs. Poole was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face, something that seemed to hold more than could easily be said across a kitchen table on a first evening. I wondered if you would find it, she said, eventually. Did you know what was in it? Some of it. She told me, near the end, that she had been writing things down. Mrs. Poole paused, choosing her next words with evident care. She said the kitchen needed to know the people in this house, and the people needed the kitchen to know them, and she did not want that knowledge lost simply because she was leaving. Nell looked at the notebook on the table between them, thought about 31 years of quiet watching, of noticing, of understanding precisely what each person in this house needed and precisely what a kitchen, used properly, could offer in answer, and of setting it all down carefully so that whoever came next would not have to begin entirely from nothing. She was very good at her work, Nell said. Yes, Mrs. Poole said. She was. They sat a while longer with the fire and the lamp and the settling evening kitchen around them. And then Mrs. Poole rose, said her good night, and went. And Nell sat alone a little longer with the notebook, the banked fire, and the deep November dark pressing at the small high window. The tour of the house came the following afternoon. As promised, Mrs. Poole, leading her through corridor after corridor with the brisk, thorough manner of someone determined to be complete about it, the drawing room and the morning room and the long gallery with its row of family portraits going back further than Nell could easily place, the dining room with its table that could apparently be extended to seat 24, though Mrs. Poole said this without any particular expectation that it would be asked to do so again soon. Room after room, dust sheeted where they were not presently in use, opened and aired where they were. The whole house moving past her in a way that gradually built up, room by room, into something she could begin to hold in her mind as a single connected place, rather than a collection of separate, impressive rooms. They came, eventually, to a corridor that ran off from the main landing toward the eastern side of the house, and Mrs. Poole's pace slowed there, very slightly. In a way Nell noticed precisely because everything about the rest of the tour had been brisk and businesslike. A pair of double doors stood at the end of the corridor, closed, and beyond them, Nell understood without being told, lay the east wing. "That part of the house is closed," Mrs. Poole said, nothing further. She did not slow to explain, did not offer to open the doors, did not linger even the extra moment that might have invited a question. She simply said the sentence in the same tone she had used for the extendable dining table, and continued on. And Nell, who had learned already in one day that this household ran on a great deal of unspoken understanding, did not ask. But she found, later that evening, that the closed doors had lodged themselves somewhere in her mind, the way certain small details did. Not urgently, not as anything requiring immediate attention, simply as a fact she now carried alongside the others. A room she had not been shown and had not been told the reason for, in a house that otherwise seemed entirely willing to show her everything. She thought of it again, crossing the servants' hall 2 evenings later, when she overheard, not meaning to, the tail end of a conversation between Mr. Carew and one of the older housemaids, something about the anniversary coming round again, and the housemaid saying, quietly, that Mrs. Poole always found the week difficult, and Mr. Carew saying only that some things did not get easier with the passing of years, whatever people liked to claim, and then both of them noticing Nell in the doorway and the conversation folding itself neatly closed, the way conversations in this house seemed to do whenever they came anywhere near the East Wing or whatever the East Wing represented. She did not ask about it. She had learned enough in 20 years of kitchens to know that some knowledge arrived only when a household decided, in its own time and for its own reasons, that a person had been present long enough to be trusted with it, and that pressing for it before that time only delayed the trusting rather than hastening it. She went back to her range. She thought, whatever it is old grief, carried carefully, the way this whole house seemed to carry everything, without drama, without display, simply held and worked around, the way a garden was worked around an old tree no one had the heart to remove. The first moment the notebook had described arrived on a Tuesday, not quite 2 weeks into her time at the hall. She heard it before she saw it, a sound from the scullery that was not the sound of work, brief and very controlled, the sound of someone who has decided firmly that she is not going to cry and is not entirely succeeding in the decision. Nell set down what she was doing and went to the scullery door. Lily was at the sink with her back turned, her shoulders very still, her hands motionless in the water. The particular stillness of a person who knows she has been heard and is hoping, without much real hope, not to be seen as well. Nell did not ask what was wrong. She went instead to the pantry and found the lavender, dried since summer from the beam, and the honey, and began the small cake the notebook had described, which took the better part of 3/4 of an hour, golden when it came from the oven. The lavender, present but not overpowering, simply suggested the honey, giving the crust a particular warmth that plain sugar never quite managed on its own. She set it on the table, cut a slice, put the slice on a small plate, set the plate at Lily's place, and said nothing at all. Lily came in from the scullery some time later, her face composed again, her eyes still faintly red, her hands dry now. She saw the plate. She sat and ate the cake in small, deliberate bites, and afterward sat a moment longer, with her hands folded in her lap. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "The coppers will want polishing this afternoon if you're able," Nell said. And Lily nodded and rose and went to the coppers, not fixed. Whatever had happened remained unresolved and would need its own separate mending in its own time, but steadied enough to carry on with the afternoon, which was, Nell understood now, entirely the point of the cake. James arrived at the kitchen door on a Thursday morning, carrying himself differently than usual, a set to his shoulders Nell had not seen before, taking his tea without the brief, easy exchange about weather or horses that had become their small daily habit. He drank standing in the doorway as he always did, said his thanks as he always did, but the ease was missing. Something difficult sitting behind it, carried carefully, unmentioned. She did not ask about the horses. She began the bread that same afternoon, dark rye, treacle, the long, slow first rise the recipe demanded, made 2 loaves rather than 1, wrapped the second in a clean cloth, and sent it out to the stables with the kitchen maid at 4 o'clock. No message attached, simply the bread. She heard afterward, by the reliable and slightly mysterious channels through which a scullery maid always seemed to hear everything eventually, that one of the horses had been unwell, that James had sat up with it 2 nights running, that the horse had finally taken food that morning, and, not long after, so had James, for what she gathered was the first time in 2 days. She stood at the range and thought about that bread arriving in the cold stable yard, about James unwrapping the cloth and finding something dense and dark and made with time, and understanding, without needing to be told, that someone had noticed his trouble even though he had said nothing about it to anyone at all. She thought, that is what the bread does. It says, "I see you," without ever requiring that you be seen. The youngest daughter of the house found her way to the kitchen for the first time on a Friday afternoon, appearing in the doorway with the mildly guilty expression of a child who has been told repeatedly that the kitchen is not for her and has come anyway. 7 years old, dark-haired, the wide-awake eyes of a child who missed very little of what happened around her. "You must be Miss Clara," Nell said. "I am not supposed to be here," the child said, by way of both confession and greeting. "Nurse says the kitchen is not for children." "Nurse is generally right about that," Nell said. "But you are here now. Would you like to see how pastry is made?" The child came in without further discussion, climbed onto a stool at the pastry table, and watched with the fierce, focused concentration of someone determined to learn something she intended to use later. She asked good questions. She touched, nothing she had not been invited to touch. She tasted the pastry scraps when they were offered, and gave her honest opinion without being asked for it, which was that it needed more butter. "You may well be right," Nell said. The child stayed the better part of an hour, left reluctantly when the bell rang for her nursery tea, and looked, climbing down from her stool, entirely like someone who fully intended to come back. Nell watched her go and thought of the page in the notebook, of a small girl afraid of thunderstorms, and the instruction that had come with it: "Do not send it with the maid. She needs to see a face." She thought, "I know her face now. She knows mine. When the storm comes, I will know exactly whose door to knock on." The first real test of her came near the end of that same month, when word arrived that the family would be entertaining guests from a neighboring estate. A dinner of 8, the first proper occasion the household had held since her arrival, and the first time she would be cooking not merely for the family's ordinary evening, but for a table that would be, in its quiet way, assessing her the way any household's neighbors assessed a new cook through the food that reached their own plates and made its way back, in due course, as gossip. Mrs. Poole came to the kitchen the morning the invitation was confirmed and set out, without fuss, exactly what would be expected. A soup to begin, a fish course. The main course built around a saddle of mutton the butcher would bring up from the village, a savory to close, and something sweet before it. Nothing showy. Mrs. Aldwick did not care for showy, but nothing careless either, because the neighbors in question kept a cook of some reputation themselves, and would notice, quietly, precisely, whether Aldwick Hall's table had slipped or held or improved since the change of cook. Nell listened and nodded and began planning immediately, the particular kind of planning that happened as much in the body as in the mind, timings mapped against each other, which dishes could rest and which could not, what needed the oven at which hour, and what needed the range, the whole evening built backward from the moment the first course needed to reach the table, hot and arranged and correct. She had done this many times before, in smaller houses, for smaller tables, but never quite at this scale, never with quite this many hands needing to move in quite this much coordination, and she felt, for the first time since her arrival, something close to the old nervousness she had thought she had long since outgrown. She worked the 2 days before the dinner with an intensity that left Lily and the scullery maid moving at a near run by the second afternoon. Every surface in the kitchen given over to some stage of preparation, the larder emptying and refilling as deliveries came in from the village, and the kitchen garden gave up the last of what it had to offer before the true winter closed it entirely. Mrs. Poole came through twice a day rather than once, not interfering, simply present, watching with an expression Nell could not quite read and did not have time to try very hard to read. On the evening itself, the kitchen moved the way a well-drilled kitchen was supposed to move, each person exactly where they needed to be, the timings holding, course after course going up the back stairs at precisely the moment it needed to, and Nell stood at the range through the whole of it with the particular calm that came, she had found over 20 years, not from an absence of nerves, but from having done the work thoroughly enough beforehand that the nerves had nothing left to attach themselves to. It was well past 10 before the last course had gone up and come back down again. The family and their guests moved through to the drawing room, the kitchen finally beginning to exhale into its ordinary evening rhythm. Mr. Carew came down not long after, still in his evening coat, and found Nell at the table with a cup of tea she had not yet had time to drink. "Mrs. Aldwick asked me to convey her particular thanks," he said. "And I am told the gentleman from Hartfield asked twice after the identity of the new cook." He allowed himself something close to a small smile, the first Nell had seen from him. "That does not happen often." "Thank you, Mr. Carew," Nell said. He nodded, and before he left, did something she had not expected, poured himself a cup from the same pot, and stood a moment at the table drinking it, unhurried. The formality of the evening not entirely dropped, but loosened a little, the way it seemed to loosen only in this kitchen, at this hour. And then he set the cup down, thanked her again, and went. Mrs. Poole appeared a little later. When the kitchen had mostly settled, Lily and the scullery maid finally released to their beds. The last of the copper pans hung back on the wall, still faintly warm from the evening's washing. She looked around the kitchen, at the good order it had been restored to in the space of less than an hour, and then at Nell. "That was well done," she said, which from Mrs. Poole, Nell was already beginning to understand, was not a small thing to say. "Thank you," Nell said. Mrs. Poole did not leave immediately. She stood a moment longer, looking at the room, and said, in a tone slightly different from her usual brisk practicality, "Martha would have been glad to see the kitchen kept this way." She said it, and then seemed almost surprised at herself for having said it, and turned and went before Nell could properly answer, leaving Nell alone with the banked fire and the settled kitchen and the particular quiet satisfaction of a difficult evening carried through well. She sat a while longer with her tea, finally cold, and thought about the notebook upstairs in its drawer, about 31 years of exactly this kind of evening, managed and carried and made to look, from the dining room, entirely effortless, when in truth it had never once been effortless, only well prepared and well loved, in the particular way that hard, careful work became a form of love when it was done for long enough, for the right reasons, by the right kind of person. November finished the way it had begun, in accumulation rather than any single dramatic turn. One morning the mist lingering past noon. Another the kitchen garden, white with the first proper hard frost. Another the elms beyond the stable yard, finally giving up their last stubborn leaves and standing bare against a pale, low sky. The days shortened until the lamps were lit in the kitchen well before 4, and the fire in the true hearth beside the range burned more or less continuously now, rather than being banked and rebuilt, because a kitchen this size, in cold this settled, needed its warmth held rather than merely restored. Nell had been at Aldwick Hall a full month by the time the 1st of December arrived, and found, taking stock of herself, one quiet Sunday afternoon while the family was at church and the staff had their rare hour to themselves, that the month had done something to her that she had not entirely expected. The kitchen had stopped feeling like a kitchen she was tending on someone else's behalf, and had begun, in the small, unremarkable ways such things always happened, to feel like her own. She knew the range's particular temperament now, where its heat ran true and where it needed watching. She knew which of the copper pans hung a fraction crooked no matter how carefully it was rehung, and had stopped trying to correct it. She knew Thomas well enough to know when he wanted feeding, and when he wanted only to be acknowledged, and when he wanted, above all things, to be left entirely alone. And she had learned, without particularly meaning to, the small private language of a house that communicated most of its real feeling through what appeared, on its surface, to be nothing more than food. She had read the notebook through twice now in its entirety, kept it faithfully in its drawer, returned it there after every reading the way you return something to the place it plainly belonged. Though she found she carried its contents in her mind now without needing to open it, the way she carried recipes she had made so many times, they no longer required consulting, settled knowledge, available the moment it was needed rather than a list to be searched through. She found herself waiting, quietly, without impatience, for the moments the notebook had described, but had not yet arrived. Mrs. Poole's hands in a cold not yet fully upon them, whatever the last page, if there was a last page beyond what she had already found, might still be holding in reserve. She thought, too, in these quiet moments, of the closed doors at the end of the eastern corridor, of the word anniversary caught in half a conversation that had folded itself shut the moment she appeared, of Mrs. Poole's difficult week that no one named directly. She did not go looking for the answer. She had learned enough of this household by now to trust that whatever lay behind those doors would, in its own time, in whatever way this house did such things, quietly, without ceremony, make itself known to her, the way everything else in this kitchen had. The evening of the last Sunday in November, with the family's supper cleared and the staff dispersed, and only Nell and Thomas left in the settling kitchen, she banked the fire lower than usual, in deference to the mild spell that had briefly returned, and stood a moment at the door with her hand on the frame, looking back at the room the way she had looked back on her very first night, the copper still glowing faintly along the wall, the long table scrubbed pale and bare, the small drawer in the dresser closed now around the notebook that had, in 1 month, quietly reshaped how she understood the entire work of her life. She thought of the household above her, sleeping or settling towards sleep, each of them carrying whatever they carried. Mrs. Poole and her hands and her closed week in some month not yet arrived. James and his horses, Lily and whatever, came and went behind her careful composure. Small Clara, and the storm she had not yet had cause to fear this winter. Mr. Carew managing it all upstairs with a steadiness the kitchen alone seemed to properly see the cost of. She thought of Martha Webb, 31 years at this same range, learning each of them in turn, long before Nell had ever heard their names, and thought, I am only beginning to learn what she already knew completely. She turned off the last lamp. The kitchen settled into firelight, low and amber, the copper holding what little warmth remained of the evening. Thomas, a dark, unmoving shape upon the hearthrug. Outside, the Devon night pressed close and quiet against the small high window, the last of November giving itself over, without any fuss at all, to whatever December intended to bring. December arrived at Aldwick Hall, the way it always seemed to arrive in a large household, with a family still in residence. Not gently, but with the particular busy weight of a season that had a great deal to accomplish, and a fixed date by which to accomplish it. The still-room work began in earnest within the first days. Agnes moving between her shelves and the kitchen, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this every December of her working life. Jars of preserves, and the deep dark mincemeat that needed weeks to properly settle. The good brandy measured carefully into it, the whole still-room taking on the rich, dense smell of fruit and spirit and spice that Nell would come, in the years ahead, to think of simply as the smell of Christmas arriving. The kitchen itself moved onto a different footing entirely, the range barely cooling between one meal and the preparation for the next, orders increasing from the village, deliveries arriving at hours that would have seemed unreasonable in a quieter month, and were, in December, simply the ordinary rhythm of the season. Nell found she loved it. Not the exhaustion, which was real. Her feet ached by evening, in a way they had not ached since her earliest years in the trade, and her back reminded her of the hours in ways she had mostly forgotten a kitchen could produce. But the particular quality of a kitchen working at its fullest capacity, every person in it performing at the very edge of their ability, the whole enterprise, held together by nothing more mysterious than the accumulated skill of whoever stood at the range and the trust that skill had earned from everyone working around her. She held it together. She found she could, with the particular capability of someone who had spent 20 years earning exactly this kind of steadiness, and with the notebook's quiet guidance behind her now, not consulted daily as a recipe book, she had recipes enough of her own, but held in mind as a map of the people around her, a reminder of who was carrying what and when, and how the kitchen might answer it without ever needing to be asked. She noticed Mrs. Poole's sharpness increasing with the younger staff as the season pressed harder, and beneath the sharpness, if a person troubled to look, the plain tiredness that produced it. She noticed James quieter than usual some mornings, the particular quiet of a man who had passed a difficult night in the stable and had not yet fully shaken it off by the time his tea was wanted. She noticed Lily's fragility returning on the days the post brought nothing for her, a small clouding behind the eyes that lifted again the moment a letter did arrive. She noticed Mr. Carew managing the whole of the upstairs household with his usual seamless composure, and understood now, in a way she had not fully understood a month earlier, that the composure had a cost, and that the cost was largely invisible to everyone in the house except the kitchen, which saw everything. Eventually, because everything eventually came down to be fed. She made the potted game for Mr. Carew in the second week of December, set it at his place at the servants' table without comment, the way the notebook had described. He looked at the dish, and then at her, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, simply, "This is very good." "Thank you, Mr. Carew," she said. He ate it with the careful appreciation of a man not accustomed to being specifically thought of, and recalibrating, very slightly, in response. Nell went back to the range and thought of Martha Webb making this same dish at this same table for this same man across 3 decades, the same quiet acknowledgement offered again and again, year after year, in a language that asked nothing in return and required no reply beyond the eating of it. It was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, deep in that same busy December, that she found the note she had not noticed before. She had been rereading a page near the middle of the notebook, the household's own recipe for Christmas pudding, refined, she gathered, over a good many years of small adjustments, and tucked between that page and the next, a separate slip of paper, folded once, easy to miss unless the notebook happened to fall open exactly there, which it did, that afternoon, as though it had been waiting for the right quiet hour to be found. She unfolded it, the same small, careful hand, though the quality of the writing was different here, more deliberate. The letters formed slowly, the way a person wrote something they intended to last and wanted, therefore, to get exactly right. To whoever reads this, I have been in this kitchen for 31 years. I am leaving it now because my hands will not do what I require of them anymore, and a kitchen needs hands that work properly. This is the right decision. I do not say it without difficulty, but I say it without bitterness, because this kitchen has been the best of my working life, and I am glad, more glad than I can easily put into words, to have spent it here. I have written down what I know in this notebook. Not the recipes. You will have your own, and they will very likely be better suited to your own hands than mine ever were. The people, because the people are the kitchen's real work, and the recipes are only ever the means by which that work gets done. You will learn the rest yourself, in your own time, in your own way. There is always more to learn in a kitchen like this one. That is, I have come to think, what makes the work worth doing at all? I hope you are well. I hope you are someone who understands what a kitchen is truly for. I believe you must be, if you have read this far, because a person who did not understand would have stopped turning these pages long before now. The pudding recipe on the following page has, I will admit, always had too much nutmeg in it for my own taste. I recommend reducing it by a small measure, but Mrs. Aldwick has always preferred it exactly as it is written, and so that, and not my own preference, is the version you should make for her table. Nell read the note through twice, and then sat with it a while in the quiet afternoon kitchen, Lily polishing the coppers at the far end of the room, Thomas curled on the hearth rug, the fire burning steady and undemanding. She thought about a woman leaving, after 31 years, the single place that had held the whole of her working life, about hands that had finally given out, about the particular quiet courage required to leave something you had given yourself to so completely. At exactly the moment the leaving became right, rather than a moment later, when it might have become something sadder and more forced, she thought of the line again. I hope you are someone who understands what a kitchen is truly for. I believe you must be, if you have read this far. She thought, I have read this far. She thought, I am only beginning to understand it. But I am beginning. She folded the note carefully along its original crease and set it back between the pages exactly where she had found it, closed the notebook and returned it to its drawer. She went back to the range. December pressed against the windows, the light already failing, though it was not yet 4. The kitchen entirely warm, entirely itself. The work continuing exactly as it always had. And, she found herself thinking, exactly as it always would, whatever hands happened to be doing it in any given year. It was some days later, in the 3rd week of December, on an evening when the last of the dinner things had been cleared unusually early, and Mrs. Poole had lingered at the kitchen table rather than retiring at her ordinary hour, that the closed east wing finally, quietly, made itself known to her in the way Nell had somehow always trusted it eventually would. Mrs. Poole sat with her hands around a cup of tea. She was not, Nell noticed, actually drinking, and looked for a while at the fire rather than at anything in particular, and then said, without any preamble at all, in a voice pitched lower than her usual brisk register, "You will have noticed? The east wing is closed." "I noticed the doors," Nell said carefully. "I did not ask." "No," Mrs. Poole said. "You did not. I noticed that too." She was quiet a moment longer, turning the cup slightly on its saucer. "There was a boy, Master Edmund, Mrs. Aldwick's eldest, before Miss Clara. He would be 13 now, had he lived. He was 10. The winter he did not." Nell said nothing. She had learned enough, by now, of this particular kind of silence, the kind that needed to be allowed to continue at its own pace, rather than filled too quickly with sympathy that might close it off again before it was ready to close. "A fever," Mrs. Poole went on. "It came on quickly, the week before Christmas, and it did not leave again. I was his nurse before I was ever housekeeper here. I sat with him more nights than his own mother could bear to. In the end, because someone had to, and it could not be her every single night, not and remain able to function the following day. She paused. His rooms are in the East Wing. Mrs. Aldwick has not been able to have them opened since, nor emptied, nor changed in any particular. The doors are closed because opening them means deciding what to do with what is inside them, and that decision has never once, in 3 years, felt like one anyone in this house was ready to make. "I am very sorry," Nell said, simply because there was very little else that could honestly be said. "I know you are, Mrs. Poole said. "Everyone in this house is, which is precisely the trouble. Sorrow that is shared by an entire household still has to be carried, in the end, by particular people at particular hours, and December is the particular hour it comes hardest for me. Because December is when it happened, and because I was the one who sat with him, and because Martha—" She stopped, and something crossed her face that Nell had not seen there before. Something unguarded. Martha made him a broth. Those last nights, when he could take almost nothing else. Barley and a little chicken, very plain, very gentle. She used to bring it up herself rather than send it with a tray, because he liked to see a face he knew near the end, more than he wanted anything the broth itself could give him. Nell sat very still. She thought, suddenly and completely, of a page in the notebook she had read weeks ago and passed over without quite understanding, one entry among so many, addressed to a name she had not yet met and had assumed, without examining the assumption very closely, must belong to some cousin or visiting relation long since grown and moved on. She said, quietly, "There is a page for him, in the notebook. I read it in my first days here, and did not understand it properly at the time." Mrs. Poole looked up at her, sharply, and then the sharpness softened into something closer to relief. "She wrote it down," Mrs. Poole said, half to herself. "Of course she did. She wrote everything down that mattered." She was quiet a moment, and then said, "I did not know that Paige was still in there. I'm glad it is." They sat together a while longer in the settling kitchen, the fire low, Thomas asleep between them on the hearth-rug. And Mrs. Poole did not say anything further about it, and Nell did not ask anything further, understanding that what had been given that evening had been given completely, in its own time, in its own measure, and that asking for more would have been its own kind of unkindness. Eventually, Mrs. Poole rose, said her good night in something closer to her ordinary voice, and went. And Nell sat alone a while longer, and then went to the drawer and took out the notebook and turned, patiently, page by page, until she found it. For Master Edmund, when the fever will not let him sleep, and he is frightened of the dark more than he will say to his mother. A broth, barley, and the gentlest part of a good chicken, brought up warm in a covered cup. No more than a few spoonfuls needed. Bring it yourself if you are able. He does not need the broth so much as he needs to see that someone came. Nell read it through slowly, and then read it again, and then closed the notebook gently and held it a moment against the table before returning it to its drawer. She thought of a boy she had never met and would never meet, of a woman who had climbed the stairs herself, night after night, rather than send a tray, because a small boy, frightened of the dark, had needed a face more than he had needed food, and had been given both faithfully, until the night neither one was enough anymore. She thought, "This kitchen has always known how to do this. It has always known that food was only ever the visible part of the thing, and that the true part, the part that actually mattered, was the willingness to climb the stairs." She thought, too, of Mrs. Poole, 30 years housekeeper, and, before that, a young nurse who had sat up more nights than a grieving mother could bear, and understood more fully now than she had an hour earlier exactly why December pressed on that particular woman the way it did, and exactly what kind of soup, made at exactly the right moment, might, in its own small and entirely inadequate way, help to carry it. The days following that conversation carried a particular tenderness for Nell that she did her best not to let show in any way that might embarrass Mrs. Poole or draw attention to what had been shared between them. She went about the ordinary business of Christmas preparation, the greenery brought in from the grounds and dressed along the mantels and the hall by the housemaids, the kitchen windows steaming faintly through the shortening afternoons with the work of preserves and puddings, and the great deal of baking a household this size required in the final approach to the day itself. And beneath the ordinary business, she carried what she now knew. Quietly, the way this whole house seemed to carry everything, without display, simply held. She made, without saying why to anyone, a second small batch of the lavender and honey cake she had first made for Lily, and set a slice of it discreetly outside Mrs. Poole's sitting-room door on the evening that fell, by Nell's careful, private reckoning, closest to whatever date in that terrible week 3 years past had been the actual anniversary itself. She attached no note. She said nothing about it the following morning, and Mrs. Poole said nothing either, though her eyes rested on Nell a fraction longer than usual across the kitchen table at the morning conference, and something passed between them that required no words at all. The particular communication of two people who have each, separately, decided not to make a difficult thing more difficult by naming it aloud. Christmas Eve arrived at Aldwick Hall with the whole household at its fullest stretch, the kitchen working from well before dawn until the last of the family's supper had gone up and come back down again, the range carrying more dishes at once than Nell had asked of it since her arrival, the still-room's careful December work finally reaching the table in the form of the mincemeat and the preserves and the great dark pudding that had, this year, exactly the measure of nutmeg the notebook's slip of paper had recommended, and not the measure Mrs. Aldwick was accustomed to. A small private adjustment Nell made, and did not mention to anyone, trusting that a household in its first Christmas with a new cook might reasonably expect 1 or 2 small differences, and that this one, at least, would go entirely unremarked upon by anyone at the table. The family had guests that evening, and the dining room, Mr. Carew reported afterward, had been noisier and warmer than it had been in some years, laughter carrying down the back stairs in a way that made Lily look up from her work more than once, with an expression Nell recognized, the particular pleasure of a young kitchen worker realizing that the sounds of a happy house were, in some direct if unspoken way, a result of her own labor. Small Clara came down herself, once, in the gap between courses, still in her good dress, to report with great seriousness that everyone upstairs agreed the pudding was the best anyone could remember, and to ask, with rather less seriousness, whether there might be a small plate of something for herself before bed, which there was, and which she ate perched on her usual stool with the particular satisfaction of a child who has successfully negotiated an excellent outcome. It was very late, Past 11, before the kitchen finally settled into its own quiet. The family and guests moved on to whatever they did upstairs on a Christmas Eve. The staff finally released, one by one, to their own beds and their own small private observances of the night. Nell stayed a while longer than she needed to, as she found she often did now, standing at the range with a cup of tea gone lukewarm in her hand, looking at the wall of copper catching the low firelight, at Thomas stretched the full length of the hearthrug in the particular boneless posture of a cat entirely certain of his own safety and comfort, at the small drawer in the dresser, closed now around a notebook that held, she understood far more completely tonight than she had a month earlier, not merely recipes but the whole accumulated memory of a house learning, over and over, across many years and many griefs and many small ordinary joys, how to take care of the people inside it. Mrs. Poole came through once more before retiring, later than her usual hour, and stood a moment in the doorway looking at the settled kitchen before she spoke. "Thank you, Nell," she said. "Not for the pudding, and not for the cake left outside her door, which neither of them had mentioned, and neither of them mentioned now. Simply, it seemed to Nell, for the whole of it, for the month, for the evening, for whatever quiet understanding had passed between them in the last fortnight that required no further elaboration. "Good night, Mrs. Poole," Nell said. "Happy Christmas." "Happy Christmas," Mrs. Poole said, and went. And Nell stood a while longer alone in the warm, settled kitchen before she, too, finally banked the fire and climbed the stairs to her own bed, where she lay in the dark listening to the particular deep quiet of a large house on Christmas night. Every person inside it, upstairs and down, fed and warm, and for the moment, at least, at peace. The days between Christmas and the New Year passed at a gentler pace than the fortnight preceding them, the household easing, by unspoken agreement, into something quieter after the effort of the feast. The family occupied with their own visits and small entertainments, the kitchen given over to lighter work, the slow use of what had already been prepared, rather than the urgent making of anything new. Nell found she welcomed the ease of it, though she noticed, too, that her hands and her mind did not entirely know what to do with a kitchen suddenly given room to breathe, and that she filled the extra hours, almost without deciding to, by returning again and again to small improvements the rest of the year rarely allowed time for. The copper polished to a shine well beyond its ordinary daily gleam, the dry goods shelves reordered more sensibly than she had found them, the still room's remaining preserves catalogued properly in a ledger of her own, so that Agnes would not have to hold the whole of it in memory alone. Agnes herself came to the kitchen more often in those quiet days than her still-room duties strictly required. And Nell, watching her work, began to understand a little more of what the notebook's brief entry for her had only gestured toward. She was perhaps 30, careful and precise in all her movements, the kind of quiet competence that rarely drew attention to itself, and therefore rarely received the credit it was due. Her mother lived in the village, and was not well, had not been well in any lasting way for some years now, and Agnes went to see her every second Sunday, and came back from these visits with a particular contained steadiness that Nell recognized as the discipline of someone determined not to let her own worry become anyone else's burden to manage. On the last Sunday of the old year, Nell made a second seed cake without being asked, larger than the one the notebook described, and wrapped a good portion of it for Agnes to carry to the village that same afternoon. "For your mother," she said simply, when Agnes looked at the parcel with faint surprise. "It keeps well." She need not eat it all at once. Agnes took it carefully and thanked her, and said, after a moment, in a voice pitched lower than her usual practical tone, that her mother had always been fond of a good seed cake, and that it was kind of Nell to have remembered, though Nell had said nothing at all to suggest she remembered any such preference, had simply made the thing the notebook described and trusted, as she was learning to trust more and more completely. That the kitchen generally knew what it was doing, even when the cook herself did not fully understand why. New Year's Eve itself passed quietly at Aldwick Hall, the family keeping a modest celebration among themselves. The staff permitted their own small gathering in the servants' hall once the last of the family's needs had been seen to. A fire built up generously in the old grate there. A little cake and a little wine passed round. James persuaded, after some resistance, to produce the fiddle. Nell had not known he owned, and play something simple and old that had the housemaids clapping softly along before the hour grew late enough that Mrs. Poole, smiling in a way Nell had not yet seen from her, declared that they had all better find their beds before the new year found them still awake to greet it. Nell went down to the kitchen one final time before retiring, as had become her habit, and stood a moment in the banked warmth of it, Thomas already settled for the night, the old year drawing itself quietly to a close beyond the small frosted window. She thought of the year just ending, of a November evening on a dark lane that felt, now, impossibly distant, of a green cloth notebook and a small hidden drawer, of Mrs. Poole's hands and James's difficult nights, and Lily's careful composure, and small Clara's frank, delighted curiosity, of a boy she had never met, and a grief 3 years old, that the whole house had learned, slowly and at real cost, how to carry together. She thought, what a great deal one kitchen can hold, if it is only given the chance. She banked the fire a final time, said her own quiet good night to the room, and went up to sleep through the last hours of the old year and into whatever the new one intended to bring. January came to the hall with real cold. Not the preliminary cold of November, nor the considered cold of December, but the settled, committed cold of a Devon January that had decided fully what it was and had no interest whatsoever in being anything else. The kitchen windows frosted on the inside by morning now, thick enough that Nell sometimes traced a fingertip through it without quite meaning to, the way a person touched a thing simply to confirm it was real. The yard beyond the scullery door glittered hard each morning when she went to check the state of the vegetable store, and the range wanted more coal than it had in any previous month, and the fire in the true hearth burned continuously now, day and night, because a bank of embers alone was no longer sufficient against a cold this thorough. This was, she was discovering, the particular gift of a Devon January to a kitchen, that the cold outside made the warmth inside more entirely itself, the steam off the pots more visible, the smell of the fire more present in every corner of the room, the amber light of the lamps against the frosted glass more deeply amber than it had seemed capable of being in the milder months. The whole room became more precisely what it was, she thought, because winter had finally given it something proper to be warm against. She had been at Aldwick Hall 2 full months now, which was still not a long time. Not long enough to know every rhythm a house this old and this large possessed, but long enough, she found, for the kitchen to feel entirely her own, rather than a kitchen she was merely tending on behalf of someone who had gone before her. long enough for Lily to have grown less careful around her and more like herself, for James to have grown more talkative over his mid-morning tea, for Mr. Carew to pause at the kitchen door most evenings now for a cup he had never formally been invited to and was never once refused, long enough for Thomas to have decided, at some point she could not precisely date, that sleeping near her at the range was preferable to merely sleeping near the range itself. Long enough, above all, for the notebook to have moved from being something she consulted to something she simply knew, carried in her, the way a person carries a language they have finally, truly learned, rather than merely translated. Godwin came to the scullery door on a bitter morning in the second week of January with less to bring than usual, the woods having grown sparse, the way they always did at the very hardest point of the winter, and set down what he had with a slightly apologetic economy of movement that was, for a man of so few words, its own small form of speech. Nell looked at what he had brought, thin pickings after a hard fortnight, and thought of the notebook's 2 words beneath his page. He will know. She made the pie anyway, that same afternoon, stretching what little he had given her with the last of the good root vegetables from the cellar and a generous hand with the pastry, and set a portion aside for him rather than sending it out with anyone else. And when he came again 2 days later, he said nothing about it directly, only touched his cap a fraction longer than usual and remarked, as though it were merely an observation about the weather, that the pie had been better than the ingredients had any right to produce, which Nell understood, from a man of his particular economy, to be as full and considered a thanks as she was ever likely to receive from him, and found she did not need any more than that. She saw Mrs. Poole's hands properly for the first time in the second week of January, though she had been watching, without appearing to watch, for 2 full months already. One morning, Mrs. Poole came to the kitchen for the daily conference and set her hands on the table, as she always did while they went through the day's requirements. And Nell saw it clearly, at last, the way the cold had settled into the joints, the slight stiffness of the grip around the handle of her own teacup, the way she held it now, with a small additional deliberateness, as though the ordinary act of holding required, this month, a decision it had not required in November. Nell said nothing in the moment. She went through the conference as usual, the day's menus, the household's requirements, the ordinary business of the morning, and when Mrs. Poole had gone, she went to the larder and found the good-keeping onions from the garden store, and the barley from the dry goods shelf, and the stock from yesterday's roast chicken that she had, without quite admitting to herself why, taken to making in slightly larger quantity than the household strictly required, in case there should ever be a need for it. Beyond the ordinary meals, she began the soup in the late morning, softening the onions slowly at the back of the range until they turned properly sweet, adding the barley, pouring the stock over, and leaving the whole to do its own steady, unhurried work through the afternoon, the kitchen filling with the particular smell of something warming and undemanding, the smell of a dish that asked nothing of the person who ate it, beyond the willingness to sit down and be warm for a while. At 4, she ladled a portion into a small covered pot and carried it herself to Mrs. Poole's sitting room, knocked, and was admitted. She set the pot on the small table beside the chair where Mrs. Poole sat with her household accounts, set a spoon and a cloth and a small plate of bread beside it, and said only, "The cold has been hard this week." Mrs. Poole looked at the pot for a long moment and then at Nell, and said nothing at first. Her expression, the expression of a person who has been seen, precisely and gently, by someone she had not fully expected to see her, and is deciding, in the space of that silence, what to do with the fact of it. Then she said, quietly, "Martha used to bring me this." "I know," Nell said. "She taught you," Mrs. Poole said. "In a way," Nell said. Mrs. Poole looked down at her own hands resting on the account book, and then back up at Nell, with an expression that was, at last, unmistakably close to warmth, closer than it had been at any point in the 2 months since Nell's arrival. "Thank you, Nell," she said. And it was, Nell realized, the very first time Mrs. Poole had used her Christian name at all. "Good evening, Mrs. Poole," Nell said, and went back down to her kitchen, and stood a while at the range, with her hands resting on the warm iron, feeling something she could not entirely name. Not pride exactly, not simple satisfaction, something closer to the particular feeling of having finally understood a language well enough to be properly heard in it for the first time. She thought, Martha Webb spoke this language for 31 years. She thought, I am only now truly beginning to learn it myself. On a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd week of January, with the family at church and the staff dispersed for their rare hour, and only Nell and Thomas left in the quiet kitchen, she found the last page. She had read the notebook through many times now, had believed. In the confident way a person believes a thing they have checked repeatedly, that she knew every page it contained. But she had been reading quickly through the height of December's demands, letting the pages pass without always giving them their full and proper time. And this Sunday, with nothing pressing and the whole slow afternoon ahead of her, she took the notebook from its drawer and began again at the very beginning, determined to read it properly, page by unhurried page. Mrs. Poole's soup, James's bread, Lily's lavender cake, the young footman's custard, Mr. Carew's potted game, small Clara, and the face she needed to see during a storm, Godwin's pie, and Agnes's seed cake, and, further in now, the page for Master Edmund that she had already found and already sat with and already understood. Each one read slowly this time, each one connected in her mind now to the moment it had described, and the moment she herself had provided in answer, and the small, unremarkable, entirely real thing that had happened as a result. She turned the pages past all of this, past the note tucked between the pudding recipes that she had already found, and already returned carefully to its place, past the last pages she had believed, on every previous reading, to be truly the last, the bread for the very coldest weeks, the plain broth kept in reserve for whenever illness came to the house and needed something that asked nothing of the person taking it. And then she found there was one more page after all. It had been tucked, she understood at once, deliberately, between what she had always taken for the final page and the back cover itself, pressed close enough to be entirely overlooked, unless a person happened to be searching with real patience, which, this particular unhurried Sunday, she finally was. She smoothed it open carefully. The same small, careful hand, but different again from the rest. The writing a little larger here, a little less even. Written, she thought immediately, with a different and more difficult intention behind it than any of the other pages had required. For the new cook, Nell read the heading and went entirely still. Not for Mrs. Poole, not for James or Lily or Mr. Carew or small Clara or Master Edmund or any other name belonging to this household. For her. For whoever had come after Martha Webb found the small drawer, read what it contained, and was now, in this particular January, standing in this particular kitchen, learning its language and tending its people exactly as the notebook had always intended someone eventually would. She read on. You will have been here long enough now to have found your feet, long enough to know the range, and the people, and the particular way this kitchen moves through its year. Long enough, perhaps, to have used some part of what I left you, and to understand, at least a little, why I troubled to write it down at all. I do not know your name. I did not know, when I wrote this, who would come after me, only that someone would. Because a kitchen like this one does not simply stand empty. It finds the person it requires, the way it found me 31 years ago, and kept me for the whole of my working life. I believe, because I have watched this kitchen do exactly this for 3 decades, that it has found the right person again. I believe that person is you. The recipe I am leaving you here is not for anyone in this household. It is for you, and for you alone. Not the egg dish I set down earlier, for the long middle of an ordinary difficult afternoon. This is for the evening, for the end of a long day in the deepest part of winter, when the cold sits outside and the kitchen has been warm the whole day through, and the last thing has finally been done, and the staff have gone to their beds, and it is only you, and the fire, and the cat, and the particular quiet of a kitchen that has completed its work for one more day. Make this, then, only for yourself. No one else needs to know of it. Below the heading, a small recipe. Good butter, honey, cream, warmed slowly at the back of the range. A very little brandy, no more than the smallest measure, the whole combined gently and poured into a single cup and drunk warm at the kitchen table with nothing else required of the evening at all. And below the recipe, a final line written, Nell thought, more slowly than any other line in the whole notebook, as though the writer had wanted to be certain of getting it exactly right. This kitchen will give you a very great deal if you give it what it needs in return, which is attention and care, and the willingness to notice the people inside it and around it, and to speak to what they need in the particular language this kitchen has always spoken. You know this already, or you would not have read this far. I am not telling you anything you have not already begun to understand for yourself. I am only telling you that I knew it too, once, and that this kitchen was the better for it. And so, in the end, was I. Tend it well. It will tend you back. M.W. Nell sat at the kitchen table for a long while with the notebook open before her, the fire burning steadily, Thomas asleep on the hearthrug, with one ear twitching faintly at some private dream, the copper along the wall giving back the low afternoon light in its usual patient way, the kitchen entirely quiet around her, the particular Sunday quiet of a room that had worked hard all week and was, for these few hours, properly resting. She read the page again, slowly, from the beginning. I believe, because I have watched this kitchen do exactly this for 3 decades, that it has found the right person again. I believe that person is you. She thought about Martha Webb writing these words, without knowing who would ever read them, without knowing a name or a face, or a single fact of the life that would eventually stand in this kitchen and turn to this exact page. Writing, instead, with the plain faith of someone who had come to trust the kitchen itself, trusted it the way a person trusted weather they had watched closely for many years, to find, in its own time and its own way, whoever it required, and to keep that person, if they were rightly suited to it, for as long as the work needed doing. She looked slowly around the room. At the range she had come to know so completely in 2 short months that its temperament felt less like knowledge and more like memory. At the dresser with its small drawer, at the long table, scrubbed pale by years of exactly this kind of care, at the herbs still drying from the beam, at the window with its frost holding stubbornly in the shaded corner. The January sun had not yet properly reached. She thought, "I am that person." She thought it quietly, without any drama at all. The way a person thinks something that has been quietly true for some time and is only now, at last, being properly acknowledged. She was the person this kitchen needed. She understood, not because she was exceptional in any particular way, but because she was attentive, because she had found the notebook and read it properly and understood what it was asking of her, and had done, as faithfully as she was able, exactly what it asked. Because she had come to Devon simply to be somewhere that was not London, and had found, in the process, something she had not known she was looking for at all. A kitchen that spoke, and a great many people who needed, more than they would ever say aloud, to be heard. She thought, too, of all the cooks this kitchen must have found before Martha Webb, women whose names had never made it into any surviving notebook, whose care had simply been absorbed, quietly and completely, into the fabric of the house itself, into a household's habit of leaving bread for a stable yard or soup for a cold January. Long after the particular hands that first began the habit were gone and forgotten. She thought the notebook was not really where this began. It was only the first time someone had thought to write any of it down. That evening, after the last thing had been done, after Lily had gone up to bed, and Mr. Carew had said his good night, and the family's own supper things had been cleared away, and the kitchen had settled into the particular stillness it took on at the very end of a long day, she made the recipe for herself. Thomas watched from the hearthrug with the focused attention of a cat who understood, with total certainty, that food was being prepared and was making his interest in the matter perfectly clear. She found the good butter from the dairy, the honey from the jar on the 3rd shelf, the cream, still sweet, from the cold store, and the brandy from the still-room cupboard, and set them all out on the table with the particular unhurried care she now gave to everything in this kitchen. Not ceremony exactly, simply the attention of someone who understood, finally and completely, that every part of a preparation was part of the thing being made, not merely the visible result of it. She warmed the cream slowly at the back of the range, added the honey, added the butter, let it all melt together gently, and added the brandy last, exactly the smallest measure the page had asked for, which she understood now to mean precisely that and nothing more. She poured it into a cup and sat with it at the table in the quiet evening kitchen, the fire low and steady, the lamp casting its usual warm circle over the scrubbed wood. Thomas settled now against her feet, having decided, after due consideration, that proximity to the cup was worth the indignity of the floor. The kitchen around her smelled of wood smoke and the fading warmth of the day's cooking, and the faint sweetness of cream and honey, and the deeper, quieter note of the brandy beneath it, the copper on the wall, the frost on the small high window, the house above her, entirely still, the Devon night beyond it, very dark, very complete. She thought of Martha Webb sitting at this same table across 31 years of such evenings, making this same simple cup on the nights when the long day needed something gentle at the very end of it, tended. In her turn, By the kitchen she had spent her whole working life tending. She thought, I understand now. Not everything. There was still a great deal she did not yet know, and would not know for a good many years to come. But the essential thing, the thing the whole notebook had been quietly, patiently teaching her from the very first night, what the kitchen was for, what all of it, the 3 decades, and the careful pages, and the particular attention paid to particular people in their particular difficult moments, had truly been for. It was for this. For the kitchen being warm, and the people inside it being properly known, and that knowing expressed in a language that required no particular courage to speak, the quiet language of a bowl of soup set at exactly the right place, of bread sent to a stable yard without any message attached, of a small cake left on a table for someone who had been crying and would not say why, or of a broth carried up a flight of stairs by a woman, determined that a frightened child should see a face rather than merely receive a tray. The language, simply, of I see you, of it will be all right, of you are allowed to sit down. The kitchen will wait. She finished the cup. She rinsed it at the sink. She banked the fire for the night, the small closing rituals of a kitchen day, her hands now performed without any need of instruction at all. At the dresser, she stopped and opened the small drawer, and took the notebook out one final time that evening, and stood a moment holding it, the faded green cloth, the softened page edges, the accumulated warmth of 31 years still somehow present in the worn fabric beneath her fingers. Then she carried it to the table, opened it to the very last page, blank, waiting, exactly as the notebook had always been waiting for, whoever would eventually come to sit at this table and take up a pen and continue it. She found the inkwell she kept for the household accounts, and a good pen, and sat down and thought for a long moment, and then began, carefully, to write. Her own hand was not her usual hand, which was quick and practical, suited to shopping lists and household accounts, rather than to anything meant to last. She wrote instead more slowly, more deliberately, the hand of a person setting down something she intended. Another pair of eyes, years from now, to eventually read. For Thomas, the footman, when a letter from home has not come in 3 weeks, and he is very quiet at dinner. She wrote the recipe beneath the heading, not the custard Martha had already left for exactly this purpose. Her own recipe, a different thing entirely, something she remembered from her own mother's kitchen, a small, dense-fruited bread that took no particular skill to make, but carried, in its plain sweetness, the specific comfort of something familiar to a person, a long way from anything familiar at all. She wrote it out fully, measures and method both, the way she wished someone had written such things down for her. Once, in her own earliest years, away from home, she sat back and looked at what she had written, her own careful hand beside Martha Webb's, on the very same page where Martha's own final words to her had ended not far above. 2 different hands, 2 different working lives, 31 years and 2 months, laid side by side on the same worn paper, the same intention behind both of them entirely, the same understanding arrived at separately and yet identically, of what a kitchen was truly for and what it could quietly do, meal by meal, for the people it was given the privilege of serving. She turned the page. Another blank page waited there, as the notebook had always been waiting. Not finished. She understood. Now, never truly finished, only continued by whoever came to this particular kitchen next, opened the small drawer, found what was inside it, read it properly, and added, in their turn, whatever knowledge their own years here eventually gave them. She thought of Mrs. Poole then, and of December, and of a small boy who would have been 13 this year, had a fever 3 winters past, gone differently, and of a woman who had climbed a flight of stairs more nights than a grieving mother could bear, and who carried, every single December since, a private difficulty that the whole house shared in feeling, and yet she, alone, in the particular way griefs of this kind worked, had to carry through in her own body, at her own hours, largely unaided. She turned back a page and found a small space remaining beneath her first entry. Enough for 1 line more, and considered a long moment, and then wrote it. For Mrs. Poole, in the week of December when the house grows quietest and the year comes hardest for her. The lavender and honey cake, small, left without any note attached. She does not need the note. She only needs to know, once a year, without having to ask, that someone remembers, and that she does not have to carry the remembering entirely alone. She read this final line back to herself twice, and found it, on reflection, exactly true, and did not amend it further. She closed the notebook, carried it back to the small drawer, and set it inside, precisely where it had always lived, ready now to be found. In some year, she would not live to see the beginning of, by some cook whose name she would never know, the way Martha Webb's name had once been entirely unknown to her, until it was not. She turned off the lamp. The kitchen settled into firelight alone, low and amber, the copper along the wall, holding what remained of the evening's warmth in its own quiet, patient way. Thomas, a dark, motionless shape on the hearth-rug, entirely given over to sleep. She stood a moment in the doorway, as she had stood on her very first night, and looked back at the room, at the range and the long table and the dresser with its small drawer, at the copper catching the last of the firelight, at the frost thickening on the high window and the deep Devon dark pressing patiently beyond it, at Thomas, profoundly asleep, one paw drawn over his nose exactly as he always slept, as though he had never once, in the whole of his life, slept any other way. "Good night, kitchen," she said, quietly, aloud, to the empty room, and found the words entirely natural. The way a person spoke to something that had properly earned the courtesy, something that would be here again in the morning when she came down before 5 and built the fire back up and put the kettle on and began once more the whole familiar sequence of a day in a kitchen that was at last and completely her own. She climbed the stairs to her small room and lay down in the dark and listened to the house settle round her. Its own particular language of sounds, old stone cooling, older timber shifting very slightly against itself, the wind moving steadily through the bare elms beyond her window, the deep, thorough Devon quiet pressing in from every side, the same quiet that had first met her on the lane, in the dark, 2 short months ago, when she had known nothing yet of notebooks or drawers, or a boy named Edmund, or a woman's careful hands in a particular cold month. She thought of the blank pages still waiting in the notebook below her, page after unused page, ready for whatever the coming years might ask of them. She thought of Godwin and the woods he read so patiently, and of a winter, some year not yet arrived, when the game might run short, and a pie might need making again exactly as it had been made before. She thought of small Clara, growing a year older each Christmas, and of a day, not so very far off now, when a 7-year-old's fear of thunderstorms would give way to some entirely different trouble that the kitchen would need, in its turn, to learn how to answer. She thought of Lily, and of James, and of Mr. Carew pausing at the kitchen door some evening years from now for a cup of tea. He would, by then, have been invited to 100 times over, and would still, out of some old habit of restraint, wait politely to be offered. She thought of the spring not yet arrived, the kitchen garden waking slowly under the gardener's patient hands, the first tender vegetables finding their way up through soil that had held nothing but frost and root cellars for months. She thought of a whole year ahead of her. And then, beyond that year, other years, each one bringing its own particular troubles and its own particular small remedies, each one adding, she hoped, some further page of understanding to a notebook that would, she trusted now completely, go on being added to long after her own hands, too, eventually gave out, the way Martha Webb's had, the way every pair of hands eventually did, in their own good time, she thought. Martha Webb spent 31 years learning this kitchen's whole language. She thought, I have had 2 months. She thought, I have the rest of it still ahead of me, however long the rest turns out to be. And found in that thought not any anxiety about the scale of what remained to be learned, but something closer to a quiet, settled contentment. The particular contentment of a person who has found, after a great deal of searching she had not always known she was engaged in, exactly the place and exactly the work she was suited to. Outside, the Devon night lay deep and cold and entirely still, the frost thickening steadily on every window in the house, the bare elms motionless now that the wind had finally dropped, the whole dark countryside settled into the particular hush that came only in the deepest hour of a winter night, when even the owls had gone quiet and the last late traveller on the lane had long since reached wherever they were going. The hall above her slept, each room its own small enclosed quiet. The family in the west wing, the staff in their narrow rooms beneath the eaves, small Clara curled beneath her own blankets, with whatever dreams a well-fed, well-loved 7-year-old carried into sleep on a cold January night. The east wing slept too, in its own particular way, closed and unchanged, holding what it held, patiently, the way this whole house seemed to have learned, slowly and at great cost, how to hold difficult things without breaking under their weight. Below all of it, the kitchen slept as well, banked and warm and entirely itself, the copper dim now along the wall, the small drawer closed around a notebook that carried, within its worn green cloth, the accumulated care of 31 years and 2 months, and, waiting quietly in its blank remaining pages, however many years were still to come, Thomas asleep on the hearthrug, the fire low and patient and utterly reliable, exactly as it had been the night Nell first arrived, exactly as it would be on whatever night. Years from now, some new pair of hands finally opened that same small drawer and began, in their turn, to learn precisely what it meant to tend a kitchen, and to be tended by it in return. Nell Marsh slept in her narrow bed under the eaves of Aldwick Hall, the particular deep, uncomplicated sleep of a person who has found, at last, exactly where she belongs, and knows, without needing to examine the knowledge too closely. That morning will come, as it always does, and that the range will be there waiting, patient and familiar, whenever she is ready to build the fire back up and begin, once again, the quiet, faithful, endlessly repeated work of tending a kitchen that had, in its own turn and in its own time, so thoroughly and so gently learned to tend her. The house settled fully into the deep hours of the night. The frost held steady on every window. The Devon dark pressed close and quiet around the old grey stone, patient as it had always been, patient as the kitchen itself, patient as the whole, slow, faithful turning of one year into the next.